Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. This is GENIX-JS, a YouTube channel dedicated to teaching you all you need to know to get started with front-end web development. We've built the HTML structure, we've styled the CSS, now we are left with the JavaScript. So in my early videos, I talked about HTML, semantic HTML, and the basics of CSS. But in this video, we're going to be looking at the basics of JavaScript, which introduces us into the world of programming. So why do we need JavaScript? So basically, JavaScript is used for interactivity and behavior of your web page. Without JavaScript, your web page is a static web page. What do I mean? It simply means that your web page has no interactivity. It is just there. It's just designed. It has no interactivity. It is not responsive to the user like that. So JavaScript allows us to add all those special and amazing interactions to our website. So basically, the first thing you need to know about JavaScript is that JavaScript is a language for the web. JavaScript is a scripting language, and a scripting language is used to write programs, write commands, just little commands that will be used to run in the web browser. So JavaScript works on the web browser, but then we have other things that make it work out of the web browser, which we'll be looking at along the line, such as Node.js and all those. So the first thing I'm going to do, the first thing I need you to do is, if you've been following this video, which I'll leave in following this series, which I'll leave in the description below, I would love you to actually download the code base for this video, which contains the complete HTML file and the complete CSS file. I'll drop two links, the GitHub and the Google Drive. So now let's continue. So to start with that, we're going to create our JavaScript file, and this is what we want to achieve today. In this video, we want to achieve this form validation that we have here while understanding JavaScript basics, right? So this is going to be a long one, but hopefully should make it short so you can understand it as soon as possible. So we'll say scripts.js. So since JavaScript is a scripting language, we usually have the naming convention of a scripting language to be script.js. So that is it. We've created our first JavaScript file. So we need to link our JavaScript file to our HTML. So remember the way I explained in the last video, the way I explained CSS, linking CSS and using styles in your HTML elements. So basically, you can link JavaScript the same way. You have what we call inline JS JavaScript, where you have direct properties, all these properties on click, on change, all those things are direct JavaScript properties into that specific HTML element. And then we also have internal JavaScript, where you have script, and then you can write your JavaScript code inside here. So you have JavaScript inside here. So basically, this is just an example, but we're not going to be using any of these two. But then you only use inline when you want to deal with specific action, like a button click on a particular button. You just only want that button to have that particular action, that when you click it probably goes to the next page, and no other thing should have it. So that's when you use inline. And then internal, for small projects like this, you can use internal JavaScript. I think we should leverage this internal JavaScript, where you can start defining your logic directly inside here. But I want to keep things structured. I want to apply separation of concerns. This is the best practice, no matter how small your project is, because you don't want to have things modeled up together, but you want to have them connected together. So we've created our JavaScript file. So I can just put a comment here. The comment in JavaScript is this, which is a single line comment, and then we have multi-line comments. So multi-line comments allows us to type more than one line of comments. Multi-line comments, mostly for description. This one is mostly for probably to-dos, short notes, etc. Right? So those are the type of comments we have. So this, you can just close this here, and then you can put here, this is JavaScript, right? So let's just increase this. Yeah. So now this, and then zoom this in. So now this is JavaScript. So we're going to be looking at variables and functions in today's video, while we leverage our knowledge to build this form validation here. Variables and functions, right? So let's just put that down. So let's use a single line comment, variables and functions, right? So we said JavaScript is a language that works in the browser. So let's just link this. So to link a JavaScript file, it's script, and then you have src, which is the source where the JavaScript file is coming from, and then you have script.js, and then you close it up. So JavaScript script is a self opening and closing tag, right? But then if you look at it very well, you can actually add your script file. You can link it either in the head. Let me zoom this out. You can link this either in the head tag or the body tag. So basically we have other properties such as async and differ. So I won't be let's explain what that means. So when you have async, basically you are telling the JavaScript to load before you're telling JavaScript to load only when the HTML page has loaded, and then when you have differ, you're telling JavaScript to load after the HTML element has been loaded. So let's look at it. So loading the script HTML asynchronously. So basically it allows us to load the JavaScript file asynchronously, and asynchronous actions are actions that are performed outside of the browser. So for example, you want to send a request to a backend, that's an asynchronous action. So you are loading, you only use async when you have requests made to backend. So this is a client side scripting, it is not server side. So we're not really sending anything to the backend, we're just focusing on just validating our form inputs. That's all we're doing. So when we can now make a step further by sending data to the backend, and that will be later on in this series. So now that is that. So then we have another one called defer. So defer is basically load this script file before the document loads. Basically load this script file before the whole HTML page loads. So let's say that you have very important JavaScript code inside here that needs to be loaded before the HTML page loads, and you can use the defer. But we don't have any of that, so we're just going to leave it like this and then put it in the head. So you can also put in the body, and there's not much difference between them, only that it will load the head first, that's the JavaScript load first, then the body, or it will load the body then to load JavaScript. So you can put it here as well. So let's just leave it here and then put our CSS up there. So that's that about that. So mind you, when you set async is a boolean property. So when you type async, indirectly you are saying async equals to true. So that's what you are saying, async equals to true. If async equals to true, rather true. So that's what you are saying. But when you type defer, indirectly you're also saying defer equals to true. But if you don't type them down, they are false. So that's just how it is. So variables, what are variables? So we need to understand firstly that JavaScript runs in the browser. So let's spend a couple of minutes to understand what this means, right? Before we start writing and defining variables for our functionality. So this is my console, this is my inspector tool, right? Let me open it up again so we can know how I did that. So right click and then come to inspect, and then it opens up this. I dogged it out, I removed it from the normal flow. Here by clicking here and then clicking here. All right, so now this is the inspector. So this is a console. In other words, this is a browser console. So a console is basically an integrated environment, yeah, where programs run. So basically you have terminal for Python, you have console for the browser, which is JavaScript. So you can run JavaScript here. Let's run 2 plus 2. Since it's a programming language, you can see it's giving us 4. So basically this console allows us to run JavaScript files. It allows us to see the results that a website is printing out. For example, a user signs in and is printing out the result here. You can view it here, and also you can use this console to check for errors in your JavaScript files. It will make more sense when we start to write the logic for our validation, but I'm going to make a different series on JavaScript, just going in depth into what JavaScript is and the concepts thereon. But this video is giving us a brief overview of how JavaScript can be used to manipulate websites. So variables. So variables are containers. Or we can put memory location that stores a value, right? That stores a value. So that's what variable is. Very simple. So look at variable as a cup. So you have a cup. For example, you have a cup and then cup has water. That water makes the variable cup a water variable. So basically the cup is storing water. So it's a variable because it can change at any time. But we also have what we call constants, right? So we have constants. So constants, they're also a type of variable that doesn't change. It remains constant throughout the program lifetime. What do I mean? If I set a constant like pi is equal to, let's set it here. So let's say we have this keyword called const. Let's say pi. So as I said earlier, I'm going to create a series teaching you JavaScript in depth. This video is just so we can get the basic functionality of the form validation, and we just need variables and functions to do that basically. So pi and DOM manipulation too. So we have pi equal to 3.142, right? So this is a constant, right? This is a constant pi, which has the value of 3.142. This cannot be changed because let's go to the console, right? Let's go to the console and let's interact with JavaScript there. So now this is the console. Let's give it the same thing that we gave it, pi equal to 3.142. Okay, you can see now it's already saying pi is already declared here. Now, why is it saying this? If you go to our code editor, you can see that we've already defined it here. And because this is index.html and the index is connected to the JavaScript file, so the console can indirectly read every file that is inside here, right? It can read the JavaScript as well. So that has already been redeclared. So that is what constants is used for. So I can indirectly select pi here and it gives us that value. So this cannot be changed because if you say const pi equal to 4, it will tell you that constants cannot be changed. So we'll be making use of constants a lot because constants are values that you don't ever want to change. You just want to use them to select and store elements or values that will remain like that till as long as the program runs. So you can just cancel that. Let's remove this, or let's just put constants, right? And then comment it there. This down here as variables. So looking at our HTML elements, what are the things that we need? We need to select each element here. Looking at our design also. So that's just a basic overview of JavaScript variables. We'll be looking at functions as we go on. So now this is what we want to do, right? We want it in a way that when the user clicks submit, if the user does not type in anything, it will show all these error messages, right? And this is going to be tricky because if you don't understand the foundation, which I'm explaining now, you might not be able to properly manipulate your HTML elements to do this. So we need to select this, because for you to manipulate something, you have to select it. So JavaScript deals with selecting and manipulating, and that's what we know as DOM manipulation. So the short form or the full meaning of DOM, which is DOM, let's put it here. DOM is document object model. So now this document object model is, if you recall in my last video, semantic HTML, I said HTML elements are objects, right? Every HTML element here has its property, and this property are what makes it an object. Basically, an object is a collective group of properties, related properties. So document object model allows us to treat the HTML element as an object, and each object has properties such as this one. Now the input has property of type. You look at here, it has property of type, that property of for, that property of class. So those are the properties of the input object with the class of inputs and all those things. So this is what JavaScript is concerned with. CSS is concerned with the elements, the class, and the ID. JavaScript is concerned with all the properties and everything about that particular element and even the whole document. So you can basically even use JavaScript without CSS. You can use JavaScript to write CSS, but you can use JavaScript to build HTML content. So JavaScript is like the superior to CSS and HTML. It can be used to manipulate both your CSS and your HTML. So document object model allows us to manipulate the elements in our HTML document. So the first thing that we'll be doing is to actually select this element. So how do we select this element, right? So there are different ways to select this element. The first way is by using the ID. So we have what we call documents. So since it's document object model, there's the document object, there's the document selector. So this is the document, this is the object, and this is the name of the object, the variable. So this is a predefined variable by JavaScript for us that is getting access to this document object, which gives us access to all these properties, right? That makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Let's visualize it in the console first before we select. So we have this, our documents. We come here and we type document and we hit on enter. So now we can see it's giving us the URL, which is the same URL as the one that is here as the document. So if we open this here, you can see the HTML elements that we have here, right? If you close this down, you can see that it's not different at all from, it's not different from what we have here, except from that Grammarly. Okay, the Grammarly is even there. So that is it. JavaScript gives us access to the document itself, so we can manipulate everything inside. All right, so let's get back to what we're doing before. So now document dot, you can say get element by ID. So this is a special property, very common property that can be used to get any element by its ID. And this element by its ID is the best way to store it is by using a constant. So we have three different ways of defining a variable. The first way is by using, let's put ways of defining a variable. So the first way is by using let. The second way is by using var, and the third way is by using const, right? So what are each of these? So let basically allows us to define a variable that can be changed. So basically variables that can easily be changed, such as age of someone, username of someone, like in a chat app wants to change its profile name. So basically you can use let, but constants are to define variables, a variable that remains constant and that cannot be changed. So that's basically what const is used for. So var is similar to let, only that it is used in a block and not outside a block. So what do I mean by this? For example, you have, now this is when we now come into functions. So basically functions are statements, lines of code that can be used to perform a specific task. Programming is a collection of different functions. A program is a collection of different functions, and those functions perform tasks. So now look at this. Now this, typing this, storing it to database is a function. Submitting it to database is another function. Selecting all this and storing the values is another function. So basically functions are, sorry it's so disorganized, functions are lines of statements or code used to perform a specific task. So your function should be very specific. Your function should be specific and function to not perform more than one task. So you can have different functions in your program. So that's the best practice for JavaScript, and that's what we're going to be doing here, right? That's what we're going to be doing here today. So let's continue. Let's put this to the left. All right, so in order for us to actually, now we're talking about var. Var is used in a block and not outside a block, right? So basically you can have a function. Let's put example. So you can have a function, right? And then you have the function name, right? And then you initialize the function. Basically, I'm going to explain this. Okay, let's put this as a multi-line comment. And you initialize the function. Let's put it like this. Let's put it like this. All right. Please stay with me. It will make more sense when we start to validate. So now, var, when you define a variable with var, variable name to be equal to the variable value. So when you define an element, a variable using var, basically what you are saying is that the variable is only available inside this function right? It's not available outside of this function. So if I come outside here and I say, if I come outside here, so if I come outside here and I say variable name is equal to new value, this is going to give me error, right? Because the variable name is only available inside the function name. I can only use it inside here, so it's like it dies immediately this function is executed, right? So that's just the basics of functions and var and const. So let's get started by selecting our elements. As I said earlier, I'm going to create a series on JavaScript to teach us deeply the concepts of JavaScript. This is just an overview. So now look at it very well. So we have const. So we're saying const because it's an ID, is only specific to this particular ID. So the first thing we want to select is our first name, right? So let's select our first name. So why are we selecting our first name with our ID? Why can't we select the first name and the last name? So we can't just select the first name and the last name because we want the first name alone. We want it, we want the first name alone. But if we want to do the first name and the last name and other inputs all together, there are ways you can do it. So this is the first name. So to select this first name by the ID, what you need to do is just type in the ID of that first name, the input. So the input here has an ID of first name. So you don't need to put hashtag here since already this selector is already like hashtag to JavaScript. So you just put first name. And then if you hit save, and let's access it in our console now. Let's see if we have the first name ready. So first name, let's see it's already there. We have input, and if I bring it out like this, you can see it's selecting that input for me. So I can do whatever I want to do on this particular input because I've selected it with JavaScript. I can change the color, I can change the styles, I can even hide it. So let's just do a little bit of play here. Let's hide it. So I can see .style.display, I can say it's equal to none. So you can see that it has hidden in JavaScript, has modified this particular element. So you first select and then you manipulate. That is what JavaScript is used for. So with that way you can interact with your HTML element directly without having to use CSS. So that keeps everything clear. So let's start. Let's select the rest of them. So cost last name is equal to documents dot. So I'll just autocomplete by hitting tab. So we selected our first name, selected our last name. So let's space out and let's select the email address, right? So if you check it very well, the email address, did we give it an ID? Yes. So the ID of email address, I'll copy this, Control C, and then I'm going to put email address. So mind you, look at the way I'm writing my variable names. So basically, they're what we call convention. Convention is a way things are done, but we have what we call naming convention. So naming convention is the way names, variable names are written in program languages. So in JavaScript, we have what we call a camel case. Camel case. So the camel case is like this, where you have the small letter as small, and then you have the next sentence inside. It's joined together, but then it's like this. So for example, something like JavaScript in camel case would be JavaScript, right? Java separate and then scripts starting with capital letter. So that's how camel case is. We also have other casing such as Pascal case, and then we have snake case. So Pascal is used mostly in languages like I don't know of any language using Pascal, but you can use it in JavaScript. But snake casing is used mostly in Python, but this is the one we're using in JavaScript. All right. So email address, let's select it. Document.get element by ID, and then we can put email address, right? So let's now want to select this radio group, right? We've selected 1, selected 2, and we selected 3. So now before we select our radio group, I would love to talk about console.logging your results to the screen. So in order for you to actually console.log, so console.log is like to print out something in JavaScript. In Python we call it print, in Java we call it system.out.println, but in JavaScript it's just a simple console.log, and it's done in the browser's terminal. So where you have something like hello world, this is every program has first program. So you have something like hello world, it's giving us undefined, come to that later. So hello world is basically the text that is inside here. So everything you have inside the console.log function will be printed out to this place as the output. So now we want to test that all these have been selected. So you can just say console.log first name, console.log, just follow me, first name, and then you have console.log last name, and then we have console.log email address. So if you notice, I'm putting semicolon before, I'm putting semicolon after each of the line. That's because I'm declaring the variable. It's not really it doesn't affect your program, but it's best practice you just put a semicolon just to show that you've declared that particular line and you can move to the next. It's like end line in all those other languages. Well, let's continue. So you can see now we have the first name selected with all its properties. We can directly interact with it here, and you can see the style here. So you see, you don't really need CSS like that when you deal with JavaScript, but then just to make things easier, you can use it. And then we have address, email address, but then there's a problem. Last name is not being selected. Last name is not being selected. Let's go to it and see what's wrong. Okay, it's giving us first name instead of last, so just say last, and then when you save, it should give us the results that we're looking for. Yeah, so now we have first name, we have last name, and we have email address. All right, so the three of them have been selected. So now let's move to the next thing. So in this video, we'll be selecting and then manipulating, but we won't start the validation immediately because we still need to understand some things as we go. So let's select the query type. So for us to select the query type, look at it very well. The query type is in group. The query type is in a group, so we don't need to start selecting the query type like one query type, general query, and then no. We can select it in group, and JavaScript provides us with a special selector property called get elements by class name. So we can say radio, or we can say query type, yeah, representing the query types, right? And then we can say document dot, we can say get elements. Now mind you, this is get elements signifying one unique element. Well, get elements, just like CSS, when you use classes, is signifying more than one element. So that's get elements by class name. And then if we check, you can see radio group and radio group, right? Radio group, radio group. So we can just put radio group there. But instead of putting radio group, we want a specific name. So we can put query type. And then we can now go and add it there. You can put more than one class, but you can't put more than one ID, right? So I'm just going to add it in here. I'm going to say query type, right? And here also in the input, I'm going to say query type, because the input we want to select. We have no business with the label using JavaScript because the input is what stores the data. So we have query type, and we have query type. Oh, sorry, I added it to this place instead of to the inputs. So it's actually the inputs, right? Just paste this off here. Okay, so without wasting any much of our time, we've selected the query type. So let's check if it is printing out the query type. We have console.log query types, and then we should see a group like an array looking query type. So yeah, now let me explain what arrays are. All right, so arrays are similar to objects, only that arrays are like lists. What do I mean? Arrays are not, they don't contain properties, they contain single elements. Arrays can contain an object, right? Objects can contain an array. So arrays are like collection of different items, collection of different list items. So you can have different elements of different data types in arrays. So that brings us to what we know as data types and data structures in JavaScript. So data types and data structures in JavaScript. So quickly, data types are like how values are stored, the value type of values that are stored in a variable in JavaScript. So we have the string, we have integer or number, we have boolean. So these are the basic data types that we have: string representing text, integer representing number, boolean representing true or false. And then we have data types. So let's just put it as data types. We have data structures. Data structures being complex data types, like a group of different data types. They are not just a single value like these ones, but they are complex values. They contain more than one value. So we have an example of data structure such as arrays. We have objects, right? We have object of arrays, and we have arrays of objects, array of objects, right? And etc. All right, so basically that's data structure and data types. Once again, in my JavaScript series, I'll be taking this in depth. So let's continue. So basically this gives us an array. This an array of query types. We have the general query, and it's the input that is being selected. The general query, and we have the support request. So now we've stored each and everything in that we need, but we've not selected these ones. So let's select the remaining, including the button. So we can say console const. So this one is just this ID. Remember that the ID is a specific element. So the ID for this is the message legend, right? So no, not message legend, is the message rather. So we're just going to copy this and we'll get it by the ID using JavaScript. Alright, so you can say const message, and then we can say document.getElements by ID, and then put in here message, right? So now that is for the message. And so we can come also down here and select the checkbox. We only need the checkbox, right? And the name of the checkbox here is I consent to being contacted. So instead of putting checkbox as the name or the ID, since we didn't use it in our CSS, it won't affect anything. You can just put consent, right? Consent. So now this consent is going to have consent. We can say consent checkbox, right? So we can say document dot get elements by ID for selecting the checkbox, right? Sorry, consent. Okay, so that is that. We've selected the consent checkbox, but mind you, this consent checkbox is going to have a value of true or false, because as the user clicks this, we're saying true or false. So a value, this will help us later, a value of true or false, how you can use conditions in JavaScript, which I'll be explaining in the next video. So now let's console.log the message and the consent box. So message and consent box, consent checkbox, right? So these are all our variables. These are all the variables that we need. The last one being the button. So we can just say const submit button. So, and the submit button, if you look at it very well, it has an ID of submit button. Very straightforward, because we're going to be adding an event listener to this button, and event listeners are functions that help us to handle specific events on a particular element, such as click events, scroll events, type in events, and all those things. So we'll be looking at that in the next video. So get elements by ID. So you can put this as submit button, right? So that is, these are all our variables. I'm going to just console.log submit button, and you should see everything printing out. So this is all we need, or these are all we need for this validation of this particular web page. And the contact form, so you can see we have the text area with its properties, and if you look at it very well, the same row that we set :50, you can see it's the same thing to show that it is actually the real stuff. According to here, see calls 50, and then rows also 50, and rows 5. So that's pretty much about JavaScript selection, what we need for this video. So let's look at our design and see how we can start validating this particular form. So here you can see, as the user clicks on submit without entering anything, it prints out all these error messages, right? It prints out all these error messages to the screen to show that, okay, user, you've not entered your field, you've not entered this one, you've not entered this one. So you print out this error message. And if you look at the next design, this is when the user now selects it. This is what it gives us when the user selects it, right? This is what it gives us. It doesn't give us any error. It highlights this. It puts an outline. You can see, as I said earlier, it puts an outline of green. It puts an outline of green, but the error puts an outline of red. So that's when outlines are useful. And then this is where, okay, this is when it is empty, right? When you hover on it, which we'll be using CSS to do. And this is the mobile view. This is when it has been sent, and that's all. So in this video, we'll just be working on the validation and see how far we should go with that. So now the first thing we need to do, we can highlight this and just comment it out, Control/. So now we're looking at the function. So let's just put this. So we'll put this as variables. So these are the variables for our program, and these are the functions for our programs. Functions. So functions are lines of statement that is perform this particular task, right? So we need different functions for this. So we need, number one function that we need is the input validation function. So to create a function, you just use this keyword function input validation, and then so this is a function. So basically what this function is going to do is, this function is going to perform the task of checking the inputs if they are empty. So mind you, I know this might be overwhelming now, but JavaScript is easy to understand if you understand the basics. If you know how variables works, how functions work, when you should use them, how you should write them, the syntax, you would be able to write any logic for any web page. So it's not so difficult, just follow me. So now look at it very well. Input validation, according to the function name, we're validating inputs. So your function name should be proportional to the function action, right? So now this input validation name is going to take in our inputs. So in functions, we have what we call parameters, right? We have what we call parameters, and we have what we call return values. So parameters are basically values that, or variables that are, so we have parameter. So parameters are basically variables that are passed into a function to be used by that function to return a value or to perform an action. I come again. Parameters are variables that are used by a function. They are passed into the function when the function is called, used by that function to return a value or to perform an action. So in this case, input validation will be taking the parameters of the, we'll be taking the inputs as the parameters, right? We'll be taking the inputs and the parameters, and after taking the input and the parameters, we're going to make use of those inputs, we'll validate those inputs, and then we're going to return whether the inputs are valid or not. So how do we do that? Let's type comment. This function takes in the inputs. Let's put takes in all the inputs. And when I mean inputs, I'm talking of first name, last name, email address, general query, this message, and this. So all these boxes are the inputs, right? So now takes in all the inputs and validates them. Okay, takes in all the inputs, validates them, and returns a boolean value. So when I mean boolean, I'm meaning true or false, if they are valid or not. So basically this function is taking in this, so this description is easy to understand. It takes in all the inputs, and when we mean all the inputs, we're passing from here to here, inside here, to be used by this function, and then returning true or false if they are valid or not. So it takes in all the inputs, validates them. So to validate means we're checking if there's error. So let's put checks if there are errors, and the errors such as empty inputs or invalid format of the input, right? So validate them and return a boolean value, true or false, if they are valid or not. So valid will be based on if they are empty or not, or if they are invalid or not. So those are the two things we'll be considering. We're considering emptiness of the inputs and valid inputs or invalid inputs. So now, before we start defining our logic, let us define our parameters. So the first parameter is the first name. So we have first name. So you can define parameters this way, or putting everything, so that when we call our function, we just put those parameters in place. So just follow me. So now we have first name, we have last name, we have email address. It doesn't have to be the same name, but make sure it's like very similar to the variable names, but I'll just use the same name for simplicity. We have the query types, we have the message, we have the consent checkbox. All right, so these are the parameters that we are passing into this function. So there are 6 in number. So the function is going to check all these parameters if they are empty or if they are invalid. We have more functions that will deal with invalid format, valid format, more functions that will deal with email address format, password length, and all those things. So let's just continue. So now we understand what we want to use this function to do, right? So the first thing that we're going to do now is we're going to write the logic for checking our first name. If our first name is empty, or if our first name, or if our last name is empty, or if our email address is empty, or if our query types is empty, or if our message is empty, or if our consent box checkbox is empty. So let's start with first name. So we have what we call conditions, right? So conditions, basically, conditions are statements used to make a decision. And in JavaScript, you make a lot of decisions. You will be making lots of decisions in JavaScript. For example, if I click on this, if I click on this, this should happen. Else, this should happen. So that's like a condition. A condition is like a parameter, or like before this happens, make sure this is ready. If this is this, then this should happen. So basically, if the first name is empty and it is invalid format. So let's deal with empty first. If the first name is empty, then we want to return false, that it is not valid. So we're going to be defining the first name variable. That's the first name valid variable. So we're going to say let first name, let is first name valid, let its first name valid. So by default, it's going to be equal to false by default, because the user has not entered anything, so we don't know what is happening yet. So this all input validation, we're validating all of our inputs that we defined here. So we're going to do that for the rest of the inputs. We're going to say let is last name valid, false, let is email address valid, false. All right, so we're going to be making a change here, because now let's look at this function very well. This function is taking in all the inputs, validating them. It's checking if there are errors such as empty input or invalid formats, which we'll be defining later as we go on, and it's returning a boolean value. So basically, if we're returning a boolean value, then this is going to be undefined. So undefined is another type of data type in JavaScript, and undefined basically, you can just add here undefined. So undefined basically tells us that something has not been defined yet, something does not have a value yet, something is not definite. And then we also have another last data type known as null. So null basically tells us that there's no value, we're not setting anything for that, it is just null. But undefined means that value has not been defined for it yet, it's indefinite. So undefined is more like a promise that there will be a value. Null is like there's no value there. So now let's continue. So basically, we're going to give them a value of undefined. So we don't know them yet. Based on this, but they will be returning boolean values. So now let's go on. Let's is query type valid. Is query types valid. So we don't know what it is yet. That is message valid. So this is message valid, is first name valid, basically saying are they valid, true or false, and based on whatever the user types in, checking if it is empty or not, or if correct format or not, will determine that. So now we defined our validation variable, so we can just put a comment here and call this validation variable. So these validation variables are going to be very useful because they are the ones that will contain all the Boolean values that we'll be using. So now let's talk about JavaScript statements. So we have conditions, as we explained earlier. So the condition we'll be using here is known, we're going to be using the if statement. So we have something like if. So we'll be in the if statement, this statement is basically the keyword, which is this if, and then the condition, which is what will make us make the decision. So the condition is usually an operator, you comparing two things together, basically, and putting in simple terms, you comparing two things together. If boy is equal to, if boy is taller than, if boy's height is taller than 7 feet, boy, print out boy is tall. But in this case, we're going to say if the first name, that's this. So this condition statement is saying if the first name dot the value. So basically we're getting the value because the value is an object property of this particular first name element, right, and each of the elements as well. So we're going to say if the first name dot value is empty, that's empty string, right, because the value is in strings. What should we do? If the first name dot value is empty string, then we're going to be returning, we're going to be changing the value, we're going to be setting its first name value to be equal to false. So we're going to say its first name valid is equal to false, right? So basically if the first name value is empty, if it's empty, then it should be equal to false. Then we can put something like else. So basically if always has an else, and else is the last block in an if statement. So when you say if something is equal to something, do this, else do this. That's basically what we're saying. But we have certain situations where we might want to have more than one if statement. So that's when we now use things like else ifs. But let's just continue. So we can say is else is first name valid is equal to true. So basically what this block is saying is that if the first name value is empty, if there's nothing here and the user clicks on submit, if there's nothing here and the user clicks on submit, set the is first name valid to be equal to false. That means this is not valid. We would later print out that error message according to our design here. We'll later print out the error message here. This field is required to the user. So let's just continue. So else, print it to be equal to true. So we can just put a comment here that says validating first name input. So let's type the remaining, right? So now we're going to say validating last name input. And in order for us to do this, we're going to do the same thing. So when it checks all this, it stores the value inside this variable and then it keeps it for us to use it. So remember, a function returns a value. So we have different types of functions. So let's just put this here. Functions are of different types, such as, so we have void functions. So void functions, they don't return a value, but they perform an action. E.g., a function that redirects a user to another page after signing up to the home page after signing up. It returns no value, it's just performing an action. We have return value functions. So basically these return value functions, they return a value. So in this return value function, they might perform an action and or not, and return a value. So basically we can just say that the action that these ones perform is that they return a value. Returning a value is their main action, because every function must return a value, either void or not. So the last one that we have is functions with parameters. So they take in parameters as arguments. So now let me break all these terms down to you guys. So for those of us that are not familiar with JavaScript, it's very important to understand the different types of functions and when you need to use each types. So basically, void functions are functions that they don't return a value. An example of a void function is you have function something like navigate to home page, right? So basically, this function will just navigate the user to the home page, right? That's what this function is going to do. It doesn't return any value because the value is going to be void, and you can see here void, right? It is not returning any value. So that's an example of void function. So we can just Control X and then Control V, and then we can highlight this and Control / to comment it as an example of void function. So return value functions. An example of return value functions, we have something like calculate age. So return value function, this one will calculate the age. For example, I can just say age is equal to, let's say let age is equal to current year, just a demo, current year minus date of birth or year of birth, right? So basically this is a function, so we can now say return age. So now this function is returning a value of number. As you can see, calculate age. Why do we say it's a value of number? We say it's a value of number because by default JavaScript is already ready to have a number because of this minus. So JavaScript is a loosely typed language. We'll come back to this in my JavaScript series, but just know that JavaScript is a loosely typed language. It is not strictly typed like other languages. So now we have age. Don't just in your mind just put that okay, JavaScript is a language that the data types can change at any time. Just have that at the back of your mind. So this is returning a value. This is a function that returns a value, and the value type is number, age. So this is return value function. So function with parameters, they take parameters as arguments. Why? Because parameters are the variables that are defined for a function to receive when you call the function, right? So to call a function, basically, let's call this calculate age now. To call calculate age, we'll just say calculate age, and then once you do this, you've called the function. Basically, this calls your function, right? And if you want to call a function with parameter, first you have to define the function with those parameters. So let's say function. So what can we say here? Let's say print message to user, print message to user, and then this takes in the user's name. So the first parameter will be the username, and the second parameter will be the message. So if you look at it very well now, this function parameter, they can either return a value or perform an action or do both, or even do none and just do nothing basically, but they will take in that parameter probably to store it in database or something. So basically these kind of functions are mostly used in JavaScript, and that's what we're using here, functions with parameters. If you look at our function here, we have this as our parameters, we're using them, and then we're returning a value, and this value is like the valid state of each of these inputs. So I hope you understand that. So now we can return a value. Let's return a string, right? We didn't talk about strings, but then strings in JavaScript are defined this way. So you have hello world. Strings are in double quotes, numbers are in just, you can type a number, you can return a number like this, right? And then you have boolean, you can return a boolean like this, false, and you can also return a boolean like this, true. So I'll be discussing all this in my series, but this is just an overview. So now we're just going to return username, comma, message. And for this to be inside a string, there's something called concatenation. So concatenation allows us to join two strings together, especially if they are stored in a variable, because variables cannot be used inside a string unless they are concatenated with a string, unless they are joined with a string. So let's create a string and say username, and then to concatenate this, we can put something like a full stop, and then put another full stop. So full stop is like you're joining it together plus space, and then you can put another full stop, and then you can say message, right? I know this is confusing, but it's just to demonstrate JavaScript strings. So this is the most basic way to concatenate, but we have better ways to do this, and one of those ways is template string literals. So I'll just write the format of template string literals. So let's comment this out, Ctrl//, and then let's return template string literal. It's a way of writing strings, variables inside strings in JavaScript's newest version, ES6. So you don't need to bore yourself up with all those things, but it's just so you can understand how we'll be using this in our code. So we can have username, and then message. So message. So basically this is just a way to return template string literals, where you have the string and then you have the variables inside brackets, curly brackets, to be accessed by the user when the function is run. So we can just remove all this and put them on top of the function, not to cluster our whole work. So that's Control X, and then we can put it, we can right click here and click on paste, and there we have our function. So we're focusing on this function, all inputs validation. All right, so or we can just say validate all inputs, So that's what we're doing to this function. So now let's continue. So validating the last name input, we would say if last name the value. So we're saying if the last name of value is equal to empty string, that means if it's empty, the user did not type anything and the user clicked on submit, then we're going to set the last name valid. That means if the last name is valid, we'll set it true, but if it's not valid, we'll set it false. So it's not valid if it is empty, and it is valid if it is not empty. So we'll say his last name valid is equal to true. So that's that. So the next thing that we're doing now, validating email address input, right? So now to validate this, we'll say the same thing. If the email address dot value is equal to empty string, what are we going to do? We're going to set email address value to be equal to false. That means it is not valid. Else we're going to set it to be equal to true, right? That means it is valid. So now we've already done for these first three, 1, 2, and 3, but now our final goal is actually to achieve a state like this, whereby if it is not valid, we print out this message all at once. This will require some JavaScript functionality and logic, also with email validation and username validation and all those things. So this is what we want to achieve, but we've already done for these first three, right? We've done for these first three. Let's now see if this is going to print out the Boolean values. So we're assessing this on the console to test, because we're not yet submitting the form. So let's return, remember, return functions, return value functions. It takes in a parameter or not, and then those parameters are passed in as arguments when you run the function. We'll be talking about this when we run the function, but we're not running the function here, we're running it on our console. So let's return them in an array. So an array is a list of objects or properties. So we can say is first name valid, we can say is last name valid, and we can say is email address valid, right? So how are we going to test this function? We can put it on top here, an array to return the Boolean values, of each input elements, or an array to return the validation state instead of Boolean values, validation state of each input element after form has been submitted, or when form is being submitted. So this is just a simple way. It's good to use comments to explain what you're doing. Remember, we said single line comments are used like short notes. Basically, that's what we're doing. We're describing all that we are writing, all that we are doing. So now if you save this and we come to our console, right, where we inspected. Now we want to access this function, we want to put in this function. So now I want to test this, right, without having to run the function yet, but we're running it in my console. So let's type in first name. So let's say Timmy first name. We won't type anything for the last name, we want to leave it empty. But for the email, let's type genixjs.com.ng as the email address, right? Or genixjs@.com.ng, right, as the email address. So now if we run our function, we can see that this has a value, this doesn't have a value, this has a value. We've not done for this remaining. So we want to see if it gives us, it's supposed to give us false for this. Sorry, it's supposed to give us true for this, supposed to give us false for this, supposed to give us true for this. So let's see what it gives us. So now first thing I'll be doing now is to call my function. So to call a function, validate all inputs, validate all inputs. And mind you, the function is going to be blocked because we've not passed in these ones. So we're just going to cut these ones for now, or we'll cancel them for now, since we're just dealing with these three for now. So validate all inputs. You can see it's already defining them for us. Let's save. Good. So the first name is first name dot first name, and then last name, and then the email address. So now you can see it's giving us false, false, false. Why is it giving us false, false, false? It's giving us, okay, it's reloaded when I saved. So it's giving us false, false, false because there's no there's nothing inside, it's empty. So basically this function is performing exactly the way we want. It's fulfilling what we want it to fulfill. It's doing what we need it to do. So let's just type in something. Let's put Timmy again. Let's put Genix. Don't put anything for the email. So it's meant to give us true, true, false. So let's type it again. Validate all inputs, and then first name, last name, email address. All right, so now it's correct. True, true, false is giving us what we need, right? So we can go ahead and do for the remaining, right? We can go ahead and create the validation states for the remaining functions. So to do that, we're going to leave this one like this. Let's add in the remaining parameters, right? So I'm just going to undo. That's Control Z. All right, so query types. So now let's console.log our query types, because earlier our query types give us values that are not a single value. It didn't give us a single value since we selected them together. We used get elements by class name to select our query type, because the query types are in groups. There are more than one, so they're in groups. Query type. So the class name query type makes them together in a group, which we can return as an array. So now let's look at this. So you see the query type is giving us an array. So array is a collection of elements, different types of elements. Array has methods, and array methods are functions that are used to manipulate an array. One of the methods that we're making use of here to actually manipulate each of the elements of our array is known as the for each method. Once again, I'm going to teach all this in my JavaScript series. This is just an overview. So the for each method allows us to manipulate our arrays without having to, directly manipulate our arrays and store the manipulated form without having to affecting the original array. What do I mean? So we have an array property. Let's check the array. So we have query types, not query objects, query types. So this is query type. Let's store query type. Let's check query types. So we can say type of query type. So it's an object, right? So basically this is it's giving us an object because it's actually a JavaScript an HTML element, which is an object, which is query type, HTML collection of elements. So but this HTML collection of elements is an array. It's giving us the value of an array, but it's an object type because it's an element. So we can say query types dot. So now this dot basically gives us access to different object properties, right? So these different types of object properties, we can select each of the elements. So we can say 0. In an array, you can select the elements based on their index, and the index is, let me zoom this in a little. So basically you can select an element based on an index, and the index is basically the position of each of those elements. If you look at it, this is at point 0, that is general query, sorry, that's general query, sorry, once again, that's general query, and this is at point 1. So every array starts from position 0 to like position 90, depending on the amount of arrays, and position 0 is the first position. So basically the first position here is general query, and the second one is support request. So if we actually want to select our arrays here, if we actually want to select our radio buttons here, we're going to be using this notation this way, of using this box and then putting the position of that particular element that we want to select. Alright, so in order for us to validate our radio input, there are two ways we can go about this. The first way is to use for loops. So basically we're not going to be using for loops, because for loops are like, they are an overkill to a small situation like this, but I'm just going to explain what for loops are briefly. So basically this is how a for loop is. A for loop is basically an iterative process. It's a function that continues to run until a particular condition is met. It is an example of a control structure in JavaScript. So this is how for loops are written. We have for, and then we have let I equal to 0, and then we have I less than or equal to, for example, let's say query types dot length I plus plus, and then your function is run here. So basically what this means is, it's saying for let I, which is the index value, basically representing each item inside this particular array. So for loops are mostly used on arrays and also objects, basically represent the particular elements and item inside this array. So this I represents the position of each element as you loop through. So basically for let I be equal to 0, so let I be equal to the initial value, the first value from position 0 as we spoke of earlier, and then we say I less than or equal to. So the condition is that I will always be less than and equal to this. The function inside here will always run if I is less than or equal to the total length of the array. So let's say the array is 5, I will continue to run as long as I is less than or equal to 5. And the only way we'll be able to get to the part where this function will stop executing is when I continues to increase. So I plus plus means increment, I minus minus means decrement. So let's demonstrate a quick for loop before we continue and implement how we're going to collect the validation for this input field. So now let's clear this. So now we have a variable. Let's declare an array. So to declare an array, remember arrays are data structures. So let's say list of friends. So we have list of friends. Let's say Yomi. So array can contain strings, right? So this is an array of strings. So we have Yomi, we have Femi, we have GENIX, and we have Toby, and we have Peter. All right, let's just add one more, Sarah. All right, so these are six list of friends, and then we've saved it. So now this is an array. We want to loop through this array. So looping through this array, we want to print out each of the friends that we have here. So instead of us having to be doing like this and then to be selecting them one by one, that's not so efficient. That's why we have loops. Loops will loop through each and every single element of the array. If you want to store it in a variable, you can store it. If you want to use it to do something in your code, you can use it to do something. So I'll just zoom in here so we can see it clearly. So for us to loop through this, we have to say for. So that we're saying for each of the elements inside of here. So that is for let I. So I represent each of those elements is equal to 0. So I is equal to 0, simply saying I is equal to the first one, Yomi, which is the first one, because here you can see we did it here also. Yomi is equal to the first element. So I is equal to 0, and then we can say I. So the condition is that I is always less than or equal to list of friends dot length. List of friends dot length is 6, because the total length of everything here is 1 2 3 4 5 6. we can check it here. Let's cancel that. List of friends dot length, you can see 6. So let's place this back. So now the condition is that I, which is 0, will always be less than or equal to the list of friends, which is 6. That's true. So how do we clarify this? How does this make any sense? The last part of this for loop is the increment. So basically this increment allows us to keep increasing. So once this is 0, we can print out the element at the 0. It is 1, which because of this increment we can print out the element at 1, which is Femi, until we get to 6. And then once we until we get to 5, since it started from 0. Once we get to 5, it stops, because this is the condition that I is less than or equal to the length of friends, the list of friends dot length. So basically that is, I hope you understood that. It will make more sense as we type. So let's console.log I at I. So basically I at I is basically no, not I at I, yeah, I. So I is basically representing the element and that particular index, right? So now if we do this, you can see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So now it is giving us I, because that's the what I was. I is 0, 1, 2, 3. So but we actually want to get the elements that are in that position. So these are the position based on all these inputs. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? And the reason why we have 6 is because we said I is equal to, less than or equal to. It's actually meant to be I is less than, because when you do less than or equal to, it's printing 0 and it's also printing 6, and that 6 does not contain any value, because the last value is actually 5 if you start from 0. So I hope that's cleared. So now in order for us to get our value, you can say I is equal to the list of friends at that index, and then we can print out, okay, sorry, rather than doing this, let's just say I is equal to 0, and then we can print out list of friends at I. So the list of friends at the position, which is I, give us, oh sorry, the list of friends at the position of I will give us each of those elements at where I is according to the increments based on this condition. So that's just for loop. You can see Yomi, Femi, Genix, Toby, Sarah, and Peter. So basically that's how for loops are, but we're not going to be using for loops here. I just use this to explain this place, because this is giving us an array like query types. Let me cancel this. So query types is giving us an array like value, but we're going to be using something called operators and logical operators. So I'll just comment this out. So this is another type of control structure. I'll just comment this out and put it here, validating query types, right? Query types. So for us to validate the query types, so actually have to define what the query types is, and the query types here that we're passing into the function here is actually this radio input and this other radio input, and we can only select one, but we want to find out if the user actually selected any. So for us to do that, we will say if query types. So since it's giving us an array like according to how we define the for loop, remember when you have an array, to select the elements you put the position. So now the first element here is 0, and that is the general query. The second one is the suggested support request. So now we can say at index of 0. So now we're looking for the checked property, because if you check our array, what is returning, you can see that it is giving us a checked property as well of false. You can see same thing as checkbox, because it is a check element. So if the query type array is checked, right, and so now this and is a very strong logical operator, and is a very strong logical. So we have logical operators. This is where we're stopping in this video. Logical operators, right? So we have and, we have or, we have not. So these are the basic ones. So basically and allows us to returns true, and returns true if both sides are true. If both sides are true, or This one returns true if other sides are true. And not returns the opposite. Returns the opposite of the boolean value. So this one is like negative of the other one. So you can put e.g. true, not true is equal to false. So basically that's just the basic logical operators. So now we're using logical operators here, and in JavaScript this is how you write and, this is how you write or, and this is how you write not. So that's just how it is. This is not, this is or, this is and. So we're saying if the query type, the first one, if it's checked, if the first one is checked, right? So we're not using and, we're using or, right? We're using or. If the first one is checked or the second one is checked, because since you can only select one, it has to be any of those that are checked. So for us to know that the user is actually valid, right? So follow me here. This is how you write logic in JavaScript. So we're saying if query types, the first one is checked, or query types, the second one, which is the one, is checked. That means if either of them are checked, let is query type valid, query types valid, let it be equal to true, else let it be equal to false. So I'll be running through this again and then call it a wrap. So else equal to this query type valid equal to false. So now look at this. I want to test this function now to see that it's actually working for us to actually start validating this. So what are we going to do? We defined our query types. Our query types is document that gets elements by class name, query type. And in our HTML we have query types. We have two elements holding the value, class value of query types. So basically they are the same, they have the same class name. So when we return any element that has query types, it gives us an array of those elements that have the class of query types. So if we check our console, we can see that query type is being returned to us because of what we are printing here. Because of what we're printing here. So if you run this function now, we want to run this function in our console. Stay with me. So now, for us to run this function, right? For us to run this function, the name of the function is validate all inputs. So validates all inputs. So validate all inputs takes in 4 parameters, but when you want to call a function, it is called a parameter when you define what enters the function, and it is called an argument when you pass in what is required that has been defined for that function. What do I mean? Now that I'm calling the function, whatever parameter I pass in is known as an argument. So the argument is going to fill in the space that was defined when we were defining the function and setting the parameters. So just know this: parameters are what are set when functions are defined, arguments are what are passed in when the function is called. So now the first name, we're going to put first name, and then we're going to put last name, and then we're going to put email address, and then we're going to put query types. So we've not typed anything yet, so we're not going to close it yet, but let's put Yomi, and then for the last name let's put Jacob. So everything should give us true because we're entering everything now. For the email address, let's put Jacob Yomi at yahoo.com, right? And then let's select general query. So now it should give us true, right? So now you see that our function is working properly because everything has been selected. At least one of these has been selected. So it doesn't matter the one that has been selected. The most important thing is that we're trying to validate. Is when we want to send to the database, which we are not actually doing in this video, that will consider what was selected. So that is that about that. So the next form validation that we're going to be considering now is the message. So we're going to be adding the parameter of message in here. So say message, and then we've already defined the validation variable for message. So we're going to say validating the message, validating message input. So you can just put this as query types radio buttons. So inside the message input, you can say if the message dot the value, because it's a text box, if it is empty, then it is not valid. So remember what we said about logical, please keep that in mind. So if the value is empty, then we should set is message valid to be equal to false, else we should set is message valid to be equal to true. So that is what we're doing now. If the message value is empty, that means if this particular message input, the text area that we defined, if it is empty, then set the validation state to be equal to false, that's on submit, or set it to be equal to true. So the last one that we're going to be setting is the checkbox, right? The consent checkbox. So we can add it here, consent checkbox. All right. Before I start adding the states, adding those validation states. See, now for us to finalize this, we can say validating consent checkbox, right? Consent checkbox. So now in this consent checkbox, all we have to do is if consent checkbox dot checked, since it's a checkbox, that means if the user did not check it, right? So now we're going to make use of the not. Remember, we made use of all here if either of them are checked. Since it's, but this one is only one, so we're going to be saying if this is not checked, right? When the user submits. So to use all, you put this, let me zoom in, you put this asterisk in front of it. So sorry, I said asterisk, you put this exclamation in front of it to signify a negative value. So if not checked, that means if false, because it's a boolean value. And as we defined here, we said we're going to be using this a value of true or false. So if not checked, right, we can say is consent box valid, is consent box, okay, is consent checkbox valid, rather, is consent checkbox valid should be equal to false, else let its consent box checkbox valid, let it be equal to true. So basically this is all for the validation, right? This is all for the validation, and you see how we've been testing as we are developing, we are testing. So that's how basically, that's how you program. You don't just write code or copy code and then you don't test. You test and make sure that it is working properly, and that's why the console is there for you. So we can return this value now. We can return is message valid, and then we can return this consent checkbox valid, right? So that's that about that. So that's all our function is doing. That is all our function is doing. Let's now test it. Let's see if it returns all the values. We have not yet undone the submitting. We've not undone the submitting of the form yet, right? So we just want to check if actually this is working, right? Okay, this is no longer selecting. Let's check our HTML to see what's wrong. So if you check here, for okay, the for should be the same thing, right? Consent, the for should be the same thing as the ID, and this is what I mean. When you click on this, it selects the checkbox. Yeah, it selects the checkbox immediately. Same thing as this. When you click on the label, it selects the input. So when you click on label, you click on the label, you click on this, it selects this, you click on this, so it selects this. So now let's continue. Let's test this form. So I'll be typing everything. Everything should give us true now. Jamie, instead of Jamie, let's just put JavaScript developer jav dev at devworld.com. Very fancy name. And then let's select one, and then the message JavaScript is fun. JavaScript is fun, and then don't let us check this. So it should give us true, 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 and false, right? So let's go to our console. So now in the console, what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be calling the function again. So validate all inputs. So now to validate all inputs, we're passing in the first name. You can see it's giving us all that we need to pass in here. First name, last name, email address. So this is what functions are used for. They take in parameters that can be used to perform a function and return a value. Message and consent checkbox, right? And it's good you name it. So now you see that it is working as we expect. We didn't select this and it is not giving us true because we didn't select it. So with these values given to us, we can implement our error and success state. But that's all for this video, because now in this video we've actually implemented our validation function that takes in parameters, inputs as parameters, and returns whether they are valid or not. So in the next video we're going to be finalizing everything by defining the buttons undo click event, the submit event, the form submit event. So thank you for staying tuned, and I hope you enjoyed this JavaScript video, because now we've entered into the world of programming where we're going to be breaking things down and building fully functional websites, even onto web apps, and basically potentially backend development. Thank you very much for staying tuned. Thank you very much for staying to the end. Leave a like and subscribe, and see you in the next video.